You're tuned into the Writing Community Chat Show, the live streaming YouTube podcast that brings you the stories of authors, screenwriters, and more. Indie or established, this show's for the community, and we invite you to be a part of it. Head to thewritingcommunitychatshow.com for more info. The WCCS. Together as one, we get it done.
Hello and welcome to a very special midweek interview here on the Writing Community Chat Show. Please grab yourself a drink, get ready in the chat to ask some questions to another brilliant author. Hello everybody. Yes, it is Tuesday. We are here a week before Christmas, so I hope you've got all the festivities going on around you and you're enjoying life at the moment. As you can see, it's just myself today on the show, so I'm going to be flying solo and speaking to tonight's guest. But again, we have another fantastic guest for you tonight, an award-winning author, award-winning journalist actually. And again, a fantastic author in the crime and thriller fiction areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop waffling because I'm not very good at these intros, and that's why Chris does them. I'm going to read a little intro. So Sarah Sultoon is an award-winning journalist. See, I told you that bit was right. A writer who's worked as an international news executive for CNN. We might get into that in a little bit. And for Channel 4, and it's taken her all over the world, from seats of power in both Westminster and Washington to the front lines of Iraq and Afghanistan. Her debut thriller, The Source, was a Capital Crime Book Club pick. It also won the Crime Fiction Lover Best Debut Award. It was nominated for the CWA New Blood Dagger, which is very impressive, and was a #1 bestseller on Kindle. And is currently in production with Lime Pictures. Sorry, messed that up. It was also followed by the critically acclaimed The Shot, Dirt, and Death Flight. And you can follow Sarah on X at Sultoon Sarah and Instagram at Sarah Sultoon. So that's my little introduction there, kindly gifted to me by Renda. But I'm going to stop waffling and I'm going to bring this amazing guest on. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's Sarah.
Hello. Thanks.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Sarah, one of the first things that we always ask on the show is, what is the writing world like where you're currently coming from? And where are you coming from?
Do you mean where I'm physically coming from or where my mind is?
Oh, that's a good twist on that. Both.
Like all journalists, I like answering questions with questions.
Nice. Yeah, let's go with both. So let's say where you're physically coming from and then mentally where you're
So I am physically in a leafy corner of North London, in my attic, and you might hear my teenagers yelling about the fact that I haven't left them enough dinner, so I'm sorry about that. And my dog barking at the door. So please forgive me for all those transgressions. I'm in a pretty good mental space for a writer, which it can be quite difficult. You spend large amounts of time on your own, but I'm very fortunate because I've just had a book come out, which you're very kindly interviewing me about, this little number here called Blackwater, which is hard to look at now because I'm reading it backwards. But anyway, there we go. And it's always great when you've just had a book out because you're excited. It's actually real. It's in your hands. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's not some crazy edit that you still need to finish. And I feel doubly fortunate because lots of people are talking about it and everyone seems to like it. And it seems to be getting people interested and thinking about the various things that I raise in it. So that's all really exciting and a happy place to be as a writer.
Brilliant. And with that scene then in London, obviously we know London is quite popular anyway with writers and creatives, but do you actually get yourself immersed in it at any point? Do you write in like writing groups, or do you go to, you know, your local cafe and things like that?
I have been known to write on park benches and sometimes in my car, which is more a reflection of trying to get away from the distractions of being at home than anything else. But no, I have a fairly sort of repetitive schedule because I still have kids coming in and out from school. And I also work in the Channel 4 News office 2 to 3 days a week. So on the days that I'm writing, I tend to be pinned to my desk by the window between the hours of maybe 10 and 2 while I have some peace when the kids are at school. And so it's a pretty standard sit your bum in the chair and put some words on the page and hope that they make some sense when you come back to read them over at a later date.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. Obviously a very busy lifestyle there. But that does kind of lead us into the first section of the show, which is called The Road to Writing. So I'm going to play a little video and then we'll get into some questions about how writing became something in your life. So, Sarah, take us back, if you can, to when you remember that writing was something that you absolutely needed to do in your life.
I actually didn't have that kind of epiphany, really. I was a really big reader as a child. Like, I was never without a book. I loved stories. I had a really vivid imagination, and I used to write a lot. You know, I really enjoyed my English lessons, and I really enjoyed making stuff up and thinking of exciting things that might happen and just going, you know, wild in an imaginary way. I had an imaginary friend when I was a kid. They lived in the downstairs bathroom. They were called Cub. They were in a very modern way, they were neither male nor female. I don't think I really understood that at the time, but it's quite interesting now. A psychologist had a field day. But anyway, moving on. What I did always want to be was a journalist, and I still love working as a journalist. But I had a very intense career, a hugely rewarding and a great privileged career at CNN for a long time. But I reached a point where I had 3 small children. I had quite an intense role at the time, and I was really looking to try and get some balance back into my life. And so I thought, rather than try and work in a different newsroom for less time, because I really liked the one I was in, I really liked what I was doing, I'm just going to stop it and try something completely different, because if I didn't do that, I would never know if there were other options available to me in life. So I quit my job, which was kind of like getting divorced. Not that I've ever been divorced, but I would imagine that it was really, really difficult. It was like ripping off a piece of my skin that had always been there. And I went to do a Master of Studies in Creative Writing at Cambridge University, because I thought, you know, go big or go home. And that in and of itself was an amazing couple of years. It's a really fantastic course. It affords you the opportunity to live in your Cambridge college whenever you go up there for your lectures. I can tell you that as a 40-year-old with 3 small children at home, going to live in a college with a bunch of freshers who are all really entertaining and intelligent is a lot of fun. And it also is a very wide-ranging course in terms of its disciplines. It teaches you the art of poetry, the art of fiction, the art of creative non-fiction, screenwriting. And I just really inhaled everything it had to offer. And I learned an enormous amount. I met some amazing people, and it gave me a huge amount of confidence to just try and write one of the stories that had been buzzing around in my head for, I don't know, since I had been born, since I'd been aware of what stories were. And really my only ambition at the time was to write a book, to actually write it, because one thing I learned when I was doing that course is, you know, everyone thinks, and most people do, have a book inside them, but only a really small proportion of those people can actually get it out, because it's really difficult. You have to kind of get out 90,000 words of a coherent story. And it inevitably makes absolutely no sense once you've done your first draft, but just getting it out, once it's, you can't edit a blank page. So I said to myself, you know, I've taken these 2 years away from my journalism career. I've invested time and money and, you know, brain power. I need to get something down. And I got something down, and I was very fortunate that it made some sense. And I was lucky enough to find a fantastic agent, and just as a fantastic publisher. And 5 books later, I'm really enjoying my hybrid career. Here they all are. I never resist an opportunity to show them off. So I'll get those out a few more times in this hour we've got together. I apologize in advance for the relentless self-promotion, but you know,
no, it's definitely
it's just part of the job.
No, it definitely is. So going back then, obviously there's a lot to unpack there. But I'm thinking in that moment where you're highly successful in the career that you've chosen and that you currently live in, obviously you talked about having three small children. For a lot of people, it would have been very difficult for them to step away from that life and what they'd created. So can you take us back and talk us through that sort of moment once you'd made that decision? How difficult was it for you to actually make that step and transition?
It was there was a lot of tears. Well, not tears, but like anguish, because the job I had at the company I worked for had given me so much. You know, it had flown me all over the world. I'd seen the most incredible things. I'd seen the most harrowing things. They'd completely changed me. I had a completely different approach to so many aspects of life because I'd witnessed so much suffering, and I'd worked with some just incredible people who are still doing the most incredible work. But, you know, I just tried to force myself to take a step back and to just really accept that this couldn't be all I ever did, you know, and if I didn't take the jump, I was going to become 60 or 65 and retire having only ever done the one thing. And I also, you know, news waits for no one. You know, I had some really understanding managers. They all tried to be as flexible as possible with me. There was no bad feeling about any of that. But the simple truth is that when a story is breaking, you have to deal with it. You know, you can have flexible working, you can have children, you can have sick children, you have all of these things, but you still, it doesn't wait for you. And if you miss it, you miss it. And there's no way of getting around that. So I basically had got to the point where I was just a bit fed up with feeling like I was kind of bad at everything I was doing. I was being a bad mother, I was being a bad wife, I was being a bad friend. I wasn't being the best journalist I could be because I was time and brain space was just slipping through my fingers. So when I paused and I thought of it in those terms, it actually felt like a really sensible, easy decision to make. And someone else had given me some really good advice way back when I'd started my journalism career, is just, I had wanted to move, I had been interested in moving to a job in a different city. And I was nervous, like, what if I wanted to come back to London? What was going to happen to the job I was doing? What if I couldn't get another job? And he just said to me, well, why would you worry about that? You'll just do it. You'll just make it happen. Why are you worried that you can't make it happen? You'll be able to make it happen. Like, you'll just be judged on your performance, and an opportunity will come up and you'll get it because you'll make it happen. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to back myself. And I've just lived by that ever since. So it was really difficult, but it was also really straightforward.
No, definitely. And obviously, going into journalism, what attracted you to that in terms of writing? And then how has that helped you in your career moving towards writing fiction?
Well, actually, it's a good question. It's one I get asked a lot, and it's intuitive because people think, okay, journalism, writing, they go hand in hand. And in some ways they do. Like, a huge part of journalism is being able to write scripts, write articles. But actually what journalism is about is communicating something in the most compelling and effective way possible with the facts that you have to hand. Writing fiction and telling a story is actually a really different muscle. And actually they pull against each other a bit. So one of the things that I found the hardest when I first started writing was trying to break free from the factual basis that you use when you're a journalist. You have to do the best with the information you have at the time. When you're writing fiction, there's no excuse for something being boring or maybe not as compelling as it could be, or your characters not being convincing, or your plot not hanging together, because you just make it up. You have to change it. And in the early days of writing, I realized that journalists write about things. They will tell a story about something. They don't tell a story. They have to stick to what they know and what's in front of them, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're feeling. Writers, authors, novelists, we tell stories. We have to make it as good as it possibly. We have to make it as authentic, as believable, as compelling, and as interested in as we possibly can. And there is literally no limit to what we can do. And that is an opposing muscle to the reporter's muscle. And they fight each other a lot. So some of the funniest conversations I've ever had with my agent, he's just like, what is going on here? Like, what's this person doing? And I'll say, well, you know, it's based on this thing that happened to me once there. And this is what happened. He was like, I don't care about that. Like, that must have been really annoying, because it's really annoying me reading about it. Like, you can't happen like this. And I'm like, well, it did happen like that. He said, but I don't care that it happened like that. You have to change it. And you kind of go back to the drawing board and have to forget all this stuff that actually did happen to you once, or you saw a version of it happen to you once, and rewrite it to communicate to the reader in a better way.
So how do you go then from someone who's so successful in your career and being an award-winning journalist to then going back to school essentially and learning the craft from scratch?
Well, it's difficult. This is going to sound enormously self-centered. Maybe I am a terribly self-centered person. You can be the judge of that. But it's quite hard when you go from a really busy job in charge of a bunch of people, doing a bunch of stuff that feels incredibly important and relevant, urgent and exciting. Everyone's interested in what you think. Everyone wants your opinion. Everyone's asking you questions. You're making decisions. You're doing things that affect a lot of people. And then you suddenly go into this very quiet space in your own head and have to live like that outside of your personal life. And that's all you do. And that is a massive adjustment, and for someone with an ego, sometimes you're just like, actually, no one cares what I think about anything anymore. No one is interested in my opinion. No one is interested in how I might do something or what my approach to something would be. I'm literally alone with my thoughts, and I'm trying to communicate with my as yet undetermined audience, who may or may not be interested in what I have to say, who may stick with me, who may feel betrayed on page 2, who may worse feel betrayed on page 63 and not finish what I've written. So that's really difficult. I think from, my own personal circumstances made it slightly easier, because when I started doing it, my children were still quite young and they still quite needed me. And there was like this cacophonous noise when they weren't at school, where I had no time to myself. I had no time to think. I had no headspace of my own. So it was actually rewarding to sit in that quiet space with my own thoughts and think about interesting stories or making things better. It became slightly more difficult as they got older and they need you slightly less. And I think if I'm still writing when they've gone, it will feel a much more isolated enterprise. And part of the reason I have been so fortunate to go back to journalism in a place as so interesting and lively and intelligent as Channel 4 News, part of the reason I really wanted to do that was to get some of that back alongside the writing. So I guess I haven't really answered your question other than to say that it's quite difficult. But I feel like my hybrid career now is just an incredible place to be. I'm so lucky to be able to practice journalism somewhere like Channel 4 News and practice and write novels with a publisher and with such supportive publishing house behind me and such a dedicated agent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think of a way to phrase my next question, but I don't really know. So I'm going to waffle a little bit in terms of how did you manage the ego that was clearly battling on inside of you? Because as you said, I'm going to kind of use your own words where you said, everyone was interested, everyone had an opinion, everyone wanted to know what you were thinking. Whereas when you're a writer and you write that first book, it's almost the complete opposite of that. It's like, you're an unknown. We don't know.
Yeah, no one cares.
It's going to be like that.
Who are you? What have you got to tell me? I'm not interested.
Yeah, exactly. So how did you sort of manage that transition, and what tips have you got for somebody who could potentially be going through a similar experience?
Well, two things. So the first thing is my books all have journalist, reporter, protagonists at the heart, which was really important to me because I felt like the journalist was like this underused protagonist in the world of crime fiction. There were so many police detectives. There were just as many lawyers, but there were far less reporters who were motivated by the truth and not just by getting a solve or winning a case. And when I first started writing, I was writing about these journalists in these newsrooms dealing with these stories. I was very true to the journalism, the newsroom environment. And people, my agent and other readers would read back what I've written and go, God, like these people have no empathy. Like they're awful. And you read it back and you think, oh my God, like everybody outside of our little world must think we're just total, pardon my French, dicks, because we have you know, we make light of the most appalling things, if only to make ourselves feel slightly better about dealing with their utter gruesomeness. We let our family and friends down at a moment's notice all the time with the most unreliable people. And we're pushing for something that pretty much we are the people who think it's really important. But actually, you realize outside of that environment, no one really cares in the same way that you do. And you just sound incredibly self-obsessed when you talk about it like that. So it was kind of I was able to deal with my own ego by kind of stepping outside, looking at it and thinking, oh my God, like, we're awful. We're not pleasant. We're only pleasant to eat. It's only in our little environment that we think we're cool and interesting and caring and kind. Actually, anyone, the outside looking in, we sound like awful people. And that helped me kind of tamp down my own, like, oh, no one cares what I think anymore, little voice in my head. On your question of tips, I don't know that I have any tips really, because everyone's situation is different. And I'm not by any means the most, you know, commercially successful writer. I'd like to think I was sort of critically successful, but I have not sold the number of books that many of your guests have sold. So I'm not as well known as a lot of people. Of course, I would like to be. There's the little ego voice, but you know, these things, there's loads of things at play here when it comes to selling books and building a profile. I guess the best piece of advice I got about this was when my tutor on the course I did said to me very early on, two things. You have to decide what kind of writer you want to be and what success looks like to you. Because if success looks like making a fortune, you are almost certainly in the wrong business. So if it's not financial, so if you take financial success off the table, is it publishing a book? Is it publishing 2 books? Is it writing a series? Is it simply writing the manuscript? Is it being read? Is it getting good reviews? Because being read and getting good reviews are not always the same thing. Like some books that are sort of not that great will often do incredibly well for different reasons, because they've had a huge amount of money put behind them in the marketing so that they're on top shelves in certain places. So they just get bought by dint of being there, you know, all sorts of things like that. So that was quite an interesting conundrum that I thought about at the time, and it's helped keep me straight since. And then the point he made about decide what kind of writer do you want to be. You know, certain genres sell better than others, but you get told, and it's correct, to write what you know. And I am not a romance writer. It's just, it's not a place I feel comfortable. It's not a place that I think I could be authentic. I simply don't really know. And maybe one day I will know how to do it, but at the moment I don't. I do know how to write political thrillers, and I'm increasingly more confident with writing them. Political thrillers are a very overcrowded space in the market. There's some incredibly, you know, there's so many of them, and they're all so brilliant. So where are you going to put yourself? How are you going to get to your definition of success? Those sorts of questions. Ask yourself those sorts of questions, and then be comfortable with the answers, because you can't try and be something you're not authentically enough that you'll ever write something that will communicate in the way that you want it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. My next question then, obviously moving away from journalism and then writing, but then going back into this hybrid, how did you sort of reinvent yourself to go back to it with those lessons that you've learned in the past? And then obviously you've gone down a slightly different route and you re-enter in that space again. What did you sort of learn, and how did you reinvent yourself in that respect?
Well, I'm still learning every day. The Channel 4 News newsroom is full of the most frighteningly intelligent people. You need to be on your game the minute you open your mouth. And, you know, really make sure that everything you're saying is what you want, exactly what you want to say, because the journalists and the people and the managers and the people in there are so on their game that you cannot afford to be off yours for a second. And that's a really invigorating place to be. But I'm nearly 50. I'm very excited every day that I go into work. I am challenged. I am put on the spot. I have to use my brain. I have to think. I have to really weigh what I'm saying in an objective, factual way. And it's just, I find it to be enormously stimulating. And I don't know whether I describe it as I suppose there is a degree of reinvention when you go from one type of network, an American international rolling news network, to a much more bespoke appointment to view national broadcaster with a reputation with the kind of reputation that Channel 4 News has. There is an element of reinvention there, but still the values that you're living by are the same. So there both is and there isn't really. I just try and do the best job I can every day, which that sounds incredibly facile, but it is really as simple as that. Some days I do better than others, like everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question then, on the back of that, was going to be, you've had so many stories that you've encountered, obviously being a journalist, and as you said, so many things that are horrendous that that have, I assume, have emotionally impacted you as well. So how did you decide your first book was going to be your first book when you encountered so many different stories that you could potentially put to paper?
That's a really good question, in my case anyway. So the first book I wrote was actually the second book I published, which is this one, which is called The Shot, and it's about a photographer who's seen too much and who starts to see the world in a very different way, I suppose is the best way of putting it. And it covers off a number of things that I saw. I wouldn't describe it as autobiographical, but everything that takes place in the book, with the critical exception of one key fact, which we never killed anyone. All the theatres of war that my photographer and reporter moved through are things that I experienced myself. But it was too emotional of a project to be in shape for my, I had to put it down and actually write something which had much more traditional shape as a thriller before I could return to that and knock it into the kind of shape that it needed to be in to be published. So this is actually my first book, but it is the second book that I wrote. And this is much more of a traditional thriller, but again, is based in fact. It's loosely based on the grooming rings in Rochdale, Rotherham and Telford. And the Times correspondent, who is unfortunately dead now, Andrew Norfolk, who worked tirelessly to expose the government cover-up that went on over the identities of many of those perpetrators. So it tells the story from two perspectives: from a victim of one of those grooming rings, which I have fictionalized and moved to a different place in a different town in a different context, and the reporter who exposes the truth at the heart of the story. And that was the book that made the most sense for me to write and try and get off the ground as my debut, because at the time, it coincided with a time where journalists in the real world were increasingly coming under attack for simply doing their jobs. It was the beginning of Trump's first term. He was presenting what he would call alternative facts. Journalists were being increasingly labeled as enemies of the people. I was just really tired of this profession being demeaned to the point that it became journalists were having targets put on their backs. And I wanted to create a world in which the journalist was valued again. And it was very clear to me that this was a real time story in which I could do that. So that's where that idea came from.
On some of the things you've mentioned there, I'm going to ask a bit of a question. And I don't know, again, how it will sort of pan out, but how difficult is it to distinguish between fact and fiction when you're in that journalistic sort of space? Because obviously there's probably a lot of digging that you would have to do in order to get to those facts and sort of uncover them. Whereas, as you said before, as a fictional writer, you can make up those facts. So again, how difficult is it to sort of go?
Do you mean when I'm in a newsroom?
Yeah, well, both, I suppose, in terms of like establishing facts and then presenting those facts, but obviously as well when you're writing as an author and you're presenting facts in your book in order to sort of propel the narrative and deciding what goes in and what you leave out and what's going to be important to the story and things like that.
Well, as a journalist, it's not difficult at all because it's my job, and there's no question that a fact is a fact. It's like an apple is an apple. It's not an orange. There is never any gray area. over establishing what is true and what is not. Of course, it takes some time, and you have to ask the right questions and talk to the right people and bring perspective to the situation. But there's never, that is not difficult. That is just about being professional. When I'm writing fiction, but in creating what needs to feel like a very authentic, factual space, I kind of lean on something that Robert Harris once said in an interview, off the back of writing Fatherland, where he said, if you're going to set a story against a real world backdrop, you just want to change one thing. So one very important thing. So it's not exact. So you set it against the facts, but you change the one thing that makes it different to what actually happened. So of course, in the case of Fatherland, Hitler won, right? But everything else was exactly as it happened. And then he imagined what would have happened if Hitler had won, right? So I have sort of lived, Blackwater, the book that I've just written that has just come out, is actually based on, it's a loose version of something that did actually happen, but in a completely different way to the way I describe it. So I keep all the sort of historical background the same, but the story itself is a fiction. Does that mean, have I answered your question? I'm not sure I have.
Yeah, no, I love that, and it's a perfect segue. Because we're
good.
at the point now, where we're going to go into play a little video, which is what's the story, and when we get back from this little clip, Sarah, if you could give us the elevator pitch or the blurb for Blackwater, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
So, what's the story? There we go. So, Sarah, if you could give us the blurb or the elevator pitch for Blackwater, that would be great.
So, Blackwater is a story that asks the question, what if Y2K wasn't a hoax, but a warning? And to those of you who aren't old enough to remember Y2K, that was what was colloquially termed the Millennium Bug, which is something that the world over, everyone became convinced was going to torpedo every computer with an operating system when the clock struck midnight on January the 1st of the year 2000. And this was all down to some confusion over the nascent computer technology's ability to interpret dates, because computers had only ever dealt with they'd never dealt with a date that ended in 2 zeros before. So my story is set in London in Christmas 1999, and the world is on edge in that way. There are warnings of computer failures, market crashes, global catastrophe because of the Millennium Bug taking hold on the stroke of midnight, New Year's Eve. But 50 miles to the east of London, on a fictional island of Blackwater, in the middle of the Blackwater River in Essex, a different kind of mystery is unfolding, because a child's body has been discovered on the bracken on this island, untouched by footprints, with no sign of how he died. And even more mysteriously, no one has come forward to claim him. Back in London at the International Tribune, which is a fictional newspaper, the reporter Jonny Murphy, my protagonist, senses something is dramatically off. Police are appealing for relatives, but not suspects. An anonymous call led officers to the scene, but no one knows who made it. And while the world is fixated on this potential digital apocalypse, Jonny sees the real disaster unfolding close to home. And he's just got 24 hours before the century turns and he has to report on the Millennium Bug to head to Blackwater and figure out what's what. But when he gets there, he discovers secrets buried deep in the ground below the island, more victims, some dead, others still playing for past sins. And then he stumbles onto something far bigger than he could ever have imagined, something that could change everything. The millennium is coming. The clock is ticking. Can Jonny stop it? Or should he? The people in my story feared the machines, but they should have feared the people themselves. And that's what Blackwater is about. Not much of an elevator pitch, is it? It's more of a blurb.
No, it's brilliant. And Halo says she loves the tagline. It is
oh, thank you. Thank
premise.
you.
Yeah. So with that then, obviously you've written multiple books now. What do you feel you took into Blackwater that you didn't necessarily have in your locker when you first started out writing?
That's a good question. I think I left most of my baggage at the door with Blackwater. I got, the journalism, the heroes of journalism out of my system with the first book. The kind of cathartic representations of the different battlefields that I'd seen in the second book. In the third book, I took on a location that I think is enormously misunderstood, and I have some experience of both living in and covering, which is the Middle East. It was a hugely complicated book, but I'm very proud of it. It was about it in a very uncomfortable way. It foreshadowed a lot of what took place on October the 7th, the Hamas attacks in Israel, whereas my story was set on the border between Israel and Lebanon, and I obviously wrote it before the Hamas attacks. But I was always very uncomfortable with how I had sort of envisioned something along these lines happening. And then it actually went on to happen in the real world. It just shows you that if you want to understand an area, you can do a lot worse than reading its crime fiction. And my fourth book took on somewhere else I also spent a long time in my 20s, which was Argentina and the wider South America. And I was looking at the dirty war and the stories of the disappeared, the people that were killed during the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983. All this is to say that by the time I walked Blackwater, I'd kind of left a lot of my own experience. I've done my own experience. I've imported most of the things that I feel like I have lived and can bring to my fiction. And I actually just made something up. And it is, I think, and it should be, given it's my fifth outing, it's a better book for it. I think I really let my imagination go. I wasn't maybe subconsciously constrained by things that I had actually seen and had actually happened. I was simply taking a real world backdrop and superimposing a fictional story on top of it. And as a result, I find it to be a lot cleaner and a simpler experience reading it and experiencing it as a reader. And I hope people enjoy it. And so far they seem to. Thank you at Halo Scott.
Says sounds phenomenal. Yeah. So on that then, obviously you mentioned about the ticking time bomb, essentially, not a bomb literally, but that ticking time element, which we've had an awful lot of people come on and discuss having that as a sort of narrative style in terms of there's a sense of urgency there. How do you navigate that as a writer in terms of knowing sort of how quickly to push the story at certain points? And, you said before about 90,000 words, like how do you get to that point convincingly so that the clock then ticks down towards the very final chapters?
I think it's all about how realistic your fictional ticking clock is. So, is it literally like the timer on a bomb? That can be really effective, but it's also quite crude, there's not very many layers to that. Can it be interpreted in it? Can you come at it thematically in a different number of ways? Is it, like I had, a date changing, and that was sort of quite beautiful, she says arrogantly, in its simplicity, because the date was going to change and the ticking clock was fixed to the date. But it also allowed me to I wasn't fixed to that entirely. Like, it's just the climate in which everything was unfolding, and it was all affected by what was going to happen on the stroke of midnight. But it wasn't as kind of sledgehammery as just a clock on the timer ticking down on a device, for example, or I can't think of a similarly clear example. In answer to your question of how you manage that, I really don't know. It's just quite an instinctive process for me anyway. Like, I'm not a planner, I'm a pantser. I'm sure that's come up in some of your interviews before. Are you a planner, are you a pantser? I got myself, with my third book, I didn't plan it. I didn't plan my first or second book at all, but I had so much material in my brain that it wasn't as difficult as my later books. My third book I didn't plan, and I got myself into an awful amount of the hot water in the edit because there were too many things that needed retrofitting. I planned my fourth book too much, and then when you lock into a plan and you start moving the characters around to fit the plan, when actually you've developed them enough that perhaps they should be doing different things to what you had first envisioned, that can be equally constraining. I think I've arrived at quite a sweet spot now where I plan a bit, like enough that I won't get myself into real hot water when I get into the sort of 40,000 word mark, like the baggy middle, where you've been all full of excitement, getting everything going, people are herring off, you know, your character is established, someone's had an argument, maybe there's been a couple of bodies somewhere, and then you know where you're going, you know where you're going to finish, but you've got a few more 1,000 words to get them there and you suddenly don't know what to do with them. So there's that level of planning I think I've got on top of. So I don't know is the answer to your question. I really don't know. I think it depends on, I suppose, crudity is the wrong word, but the subtlety maybe is better of the timing device that you have. Like how many different ways can it be interpreted? How many different ways can it be exploited to create tension, to raise the emotional stakes? If it's just one way, like a bomb in a room, then that's all you've really got. If it's something that affects lots of different things, like, for example, the Millennium Bug on Millennium Eve, well, that could affect a plane falling out of the sky, a financial market crashing, confidential information going public, you know, all different things that you can use to raise the emotional stakes for your characters, to up the tension in one part of the story that affects another part of the story.
Yeah, I love that. So obviously people watching now, if you've got questions towards the end of the show, you can ask them. So I'm just reminding people of that. So if you want to drop them in the chat at any point, please do so, because we will ask those questions during the latter parts of the show. With Blackwater then, what was the biggest problem that you encountered that you wish you'd have known about at the beginning?
In the writing of it, do you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, that is a good question. I have a tendency to overwrite, overstate some description, which having written 5 of these books now, I realize is something that my brain does when I'm not sure what happens next. So I default to describing the light on the water or something. And I know better now than to do that. Like, I catch myself doing it now. I'm writing my next book and I sit there and I can't think. I'm sort of not quite sure what happens next. So I describe something about the room and I just say, no. Everyone knows where you are and what you're doing. Don't do that. My protagonist, Jonny, who is the reporter in Blackwater, who incidentally is also the reporter in Dirt and Deathflight, but they don't have to be read in order. They all stand alone on their own. He was a much angrier protagonist in the first few drafts of the book, which I kind of was quite wedded to, because when I was in his head, he was angry, he was frustrated, he was upset for various different reasons. But both my agent and my publisher and my editor were all saying that it's not making him empathetic. He's becoming a very difficult character to empathize with and to root for and to feel sympathy for. And why is he behaving like this? There's too much anger inside his head that the reader is not party to. And I wish I had sort of seen that earlier, because it would have made some of the rewrites a bit more straightforward. He's a much better character for that observation. So I'm very grateful to them for pointing that out to me.
That's a tricky one, because obviously somebody else is coming into your work and sort of looking at it with their sort of, you know, commercial publisher sort of headspace. But did that sort of change? Did that make you understand him a little bit more, having spent, you know, 2 books with him? A lot of people talk about, you know, these, you know, characters staying with them, like when they're going to bed at night and they're in their ear and all that type of stuff. So was that quite opening for you in terms of, oh, actually, maybe I do need to explore this side of his character a little bit more?
I think, yes. I mean, I sort of know better now. So when I first started doing this, I couldn't help but be offended when you know, you get this quite brutal feedback, but it was all really well intended. You know, it's to help you. Like, you sort of have to remind yourself that, you know, people aren't just sort of shitbagging, pardon my French, what you've written for the sake of it. Like, it's not landing, and if it doesn't land, you haven't communicated it correctly. It's all very well for something to feel right to you and in your head, but you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for your readers. And if they're not getting it, then that speaks to a problem. I remember it with my first book, my agent telling me I needed to introduce a couple of other characters, and me thinking, why would I do that? Like he completely hasn't understood what I'm trying to do. And then I realized that I hadn't understood what I was trying to do, because if he didn't get it, then I obviously hadn't done what was necessary to make this person make an emotional connection with my protagonist. No, I think my personality, and maybe you've got enough of this now from talking to me for 45 minutes, is I have a certain force of personality, which gets bred in newsrooms, because you've got a lot of big personalities with big opinions who think they're right, who think we should be asking different questions, and who think other people are wrong, and who think something is unbelievably important all the time. And I have a tendency to kind of project that into my writing. And my editor once said to me, it's almost like everything's coming at me in this like haze of white noise. And you realize that that's exactly what it looks like. It's the inside of your brain, and you're sort of screaming at yourself, trying to move people from A to B, and they're upset and you're upset because they're upset. And how did they get so upset? And maybe they shouldn't be so upset. And why are they so angry? And it's only when you step outside of it and have someone else look at it that you realize how sort of caught up in the emotion of it you've become. And it's a real skill that other people would probably do a lot better than me, to separate your writing self from your emotional self, because sometimes to get yourself into the place you need to be to communicate something via your character, you have to start feeling it like they do. You actually have to think, put yourself in their shoes and feel like that. But that doesn't mean you communicate it in as clean of a way as you need to. You have to kind of operate two spaces at the same time. You have to feel everything that they're feeling, but then be cool, calm, and collected about how you're going to communicate it to your reader. It's really hard. I get it wrong all the time. I'm slowly but surely getting better at it. And maybe my next book will require even less edits than my last book, which has required less edits than their book before.
Love that. So again, this could be another little tricky question. But with Blackwater, then, now that it's done and it's out there in the world, what are you most proud of about this book?
Well, I'm really proud that I got a fifth book out. You know, you sort of start off hoping that you write a manuscript, and then that becomes about tarting it up to the point you can get an agent. Then it becomes about getting the agent. Then it becomes about getting it published. Then it's published. Is it doing well? You know, blah, blah, blah. I'm just really proud of myself that I'm still doing this. And I'm doing it to a point where people want to publish it and put it in readers' hands, and readers are kind enough to read it and review it and enjoy it. Someone said to me very early on, the trouble with being a writer is the champagne is always in the fridge door. You never really know when to get it out, because no sooner do you clear a hurdle, then you realize there's another one like there. You know, oh, only 10 people have reviewed my book. Oh my God, that's terrible. I need 100 people to review my book for the algorithm to start bumping it up for people. And then 100 people review your book, and you realize that someone else who published a book, when you publish a book, has like got 12,000 reviews, and why don't you have those? And you never really know when to take a breath and say, I've done this. I'm really happy with it. I feel like I have drunk plenty of champagne over the course of publishing books, but I don't know really. What am I most proud of? Just it's here. It's got some really generous endorsements from some amazing writers. I love the story I've told. I love the setting that I've created. It speaks to a really interesting trip I once took with my kids, which I never thought would form the basis of a political thriller, and it has. And I increasingly feel like, as I get older and I work in this sort of ephemeral news business, that I've created these permanent items of like the music of my mind, that my children and my friends will always be able to look through, you know, when I'm here, when I'm not here, you know, whenever. And I'm just very proud of that.
One of the questions that we like to ask people who've written a couple of books is, have you had that moment where you've looked back at one of your books and gone, the plot was this and the idea was this, but I was actually writing about this thing that I didn't know I was writing about at the time, and now on reflection it was clear that that thing I was exploring is, it's presented itself to me. If that question sort of makes sense. You don't have to explore it in any detail. You might have, had a moment where you think, oh yeah, that's so strange. I was actually exploring this traumatic event that happened, and I've only
do you mean something that happened to me, or do you mean something that happened to someone in my book?
No, to you, it as a writer of a book, looking back and going, wow, I didn't realize it at the time, and this was the plot line and this was the story, but actually that was about my exploration of this in my sort of deep psyche.
I'm not sure I have had, maybe because I'm not sure I have had those revelations. I've certainly, all of my books have turned into something that I haven't necessarily thought they would whilst I was writing them. The Blackwater, for example, is like, I always sort of wanted to explore how cripplingly damaging loneliness can be for pretty much everybody in life. And it did end up exploring that. But it more became about trust and betrayal and being lied to repeatedly by arms of state, by both the kind of the state and small levels of, families, personal relationships and things, and then on a big stage by the arms of state, by the people who are supposed to represent us and do right by us. I didn't know that it was going to be that, but then it sort of became that. But no, maybe because I have had some really intense experiences in my professional life. Nothing like some of my colleagues. Like, I was actually doing field work for a comparatively short amount of time, so I always feel quite fraudulent talking about it, because I work with people who've spent the best part of 40 years traveling in and out of war zones and seeing. I saw like I've seen as much in my little finger as they've seen over the course of their career. But that being said, I've seen some intense stuff and been in some incredibly harrowing locations, and I've had to process all that. And maybe because that is more than your average person, I have gone to some places in my own brain that other people have never had to go. So I maybe don't feel the same catharsis that other people might feel when they're writing.
This is away from writing, but we do explore it whenever it sort of comes up. How did you sort of manage that space in terms of, like you said, exploring the deepest, darkest parts of your mind and then getting back on track?
Well, my friends all think I'm deeply disturbed. I don't know, really. I think lots of journalists, if you are people who work in frontline journalism, again, I did it for a short period compared to most people. Well, not most people, but a lot of people. You're quite comfortable with the kind of dark. You're drawn to the dark parts. It's like, I can't really explain it. It just becomes important not to turn away from the darkest of corners. I don't want to sound like a walking cliche, but you're kind of driven by getting into those places. You're not driven by getting away from them. So whilst they will torment you, there is a kind of reward in feeling like you didn't turn away, you witnessed, you reported, and you memorialized, and you hopefully did right by the victims. So I think if you can say that, then you can be at peace. But there are, of course, some things that I try not to think about, again, in too deep of a way. But I think it just, frontline news journalists are driven to those corners. It's hard to explain.
Yeah. And on that, it's community questions time. So we've gone slightly over, so this will be a slightly shorter community questions, but I'll play this little video and then we'll get some questions. We've had some in already, so please send those questions in if you've got any more, and we'll try and squeeze them in. So this is community questions. So Sarah, I'll go into this first one from Halo. Thank you. If you could go anywhere and anywhen in history, what event would you like to cover as a journalist?
That's a good one. This is probably a bit. This is quite recent. It's a story that I was desperate to cover and I didn't, for one reason or the other. But the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004, I was a journalist, but I didn't have enough experience to go into the field at the time. And I was desperate to go, and I would really like to go back and be on the ground for that if I could, rather than being in the newsroom. But maybe if I could go further back to before I was born, for example. I don't know, witness the birth of Christ. That could be kind of cool.
Yeah,
I'm being a bit facetious. I don't know. There are still so many things that I haven't covered, even in my journalism career, that I'll probably stick with the tsunami.
You got 3 children, and none of them in any sort of nativity productions, because is there a sort of reenactment there for you to maybe visit?
Yeah, well, they all seem to get, the horse and the donkey and the pig parts. I have never had a baby Jesus or Mary or Joseph.
Yeah. So a question that we have in this section is, if you could take any character from fiction and make that character your own, which character would you choose and what would you do with them?
Oh, this is really hard. I think it would be fun to modernize Miss Marple. Nice. I think that could be very cool. That said, you'd be taking on Agatha Christie, and I'm not sure that would be as cool. But it's an interesting one to think about.
Yeah, no, a modern Miss Marple, I think we are sort of in that space where she would fit right in.
She could do well, couldn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that we have is, if you could change the ending to any fiction, what would you change the ending to and why?
This one is equally difficult, because my favorite book of all time is a great Indian epic novel called A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry, but it doesn't really have an ending that I would change. It's not one of these sort of twisty, turny beginning, make the end different because of the way the beginning was set up. So I'm not entirely sure about that. I did have the thought when we discussed this earlier that another book I absolutely loved is The Beach by Alex Garland, because I read it. I love the story, I love the premise, and I read it on the cover to cover on a Indian train from Varanasi to Calcutta, which, to anyone who hasn't done that, is about an 18-hour train journey, and it's not particularly comfortable even in an upper class carriage, which incidentally I was not in. And I always that whole concept of this secret beach, which doesn't exist by the end of the book, I'd love it if it still had and had been preserved in this secret way and was still around. In fact, part of me wonders, is it still around? Maybe not with the advent of social media, but maybe there is a secret beach like that still somewhere in maybe French Polynesia, like not Thailand. So that could be cool.
Look for, on social media, there's secret beaches. I love that. The final sort of question that we have in this section is, and you've kind of already alluded to it a couple of times already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So you're on your deathbed, you're looking back at your writing career. What is success to you?
I think just being read. If just one person who is not my family or my friends, but I love my family and my friends reading my books, just being read and making people think. So if I just felt like some people had read my books and felt differently about some of the things that I have encouraged them to explore, that is success. It's of course enormously gratifying to win things, to sell, to be a household name, to, be some sort of literary sensation. I don't think that's in my cards. If it is, that would be amazing, but I certainly don't feel like a failure because it might not be. I think just there is something so gratifying and satisfying and meaningful and profound about having something that lived in your head, committed to paper, bound up and available for other people to consume and enjoy and be moved by. And that is frankly the greatest reward there is when it comes to writing.
Love that. So we're almost at the hour. So just before we go, can you give us a recommendation for somebody who you think people should be reading, And can you also tell us where people can find you on social media and where they can buy Blackwater?
Well, thank you for asking. You can buy Blackwater in all your good bookshops like Waterstones, Daunt, and all the other obvious places. You can also buy it on Amazon, not that I'm necessarily recommending that over everything. And you can, of course, buy it from my independent publisher, Arenda Books, and from all the other exceptional, great independent bookstores that are so nice to support me. Burt's Books in Reading, House of Books in Muswell Hill in North London, and all those kinds of places. You can follow me on social media. You know you've got me because my handles are different. I'm on X on @SultoonSarah, and I'm on Instagram on @Sarah Sultoon. Someone should have pointed that out to me before I said it in my brain, and I should have changed those to match. I'm more prolific on Instagram than X because X is quite unpleasant when you're a journalist. So I try and stay away from there these days, but I am on there and I'd be delighted to chat with you if you engage me on X. Someone I think everyone should be reading. That is a tough one. There are so many great authors that I think everyone should be reading. I highly recommend my Indian epic favorite book, A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. And in terms of thrillers, I love everything by Tana French. I even more love everything by Denise Miner. I love pretty much everything that my good friend Kia Abdullah has written. These are all women. Read more women. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. That's a perfect message to end the show. So on that note, I'm going to try and end the show without butchering it. But thank you very much for joining Tuesday. And we look forward to seeing you this Friday when we have another amazing guest. So from me, that's goodbye. And yeah, let's see if we can do this.
Thank you.
Bye.